Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of UCalgary's webinar series. I'm Deborah Yedlin, University of Calgary Chancellor, and I'll be your co-moderator today. If you've participated in one of our previous webinars, welcome back. And to all our new viewers, thanks for joining us. We began this webinar series at the onset of the pandemic to inform and support our community members by connecting them with COVID-related research and resources. Since then, we've expanded our focus to include a wider variety of topics, but our purpose is still the same: to share and discuss knowledge and insights from UCalgary experts with our community. This is the third webinar in UCalgary's 5-part series, Pluralism and Global Citizenship, which explores how we can recognize, respect, and value difference in our local and global communities. Pluralism shows us the benefits of seeking to understand and appreciate the knowledge and experiences of others. Embracing pluralism strengthens our ability to take on the challenges that face us collectively and helps us to prosper in new ways. Today, we are discussing pluralism as it relates to fostering empathy in children and the decisions we can make about policy and curriculum to encourage our children to live cohesively and promote peace in our world. Open and inclusive discussion plays a crucial role in achieving true pluralism. Please join this conversation at any time throughout the webinar by submitting your questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Our panelists will answer as many questions as time allows, and a recording of today's webinar will be available, and we'll email you a link as soon as it's online. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're recording this webinar on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Dakota, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Moderating with me today is Dr. Aleem Barwani, physician, clinical associate professor, and director of public policy and partnerships for the Indigenous, Local, and Global Health Office in the Cummings School of Medicine and O'Brien Institute for Public Health. Welcome, Aleem. Over to you.
Thank you, Deborah, and welcome to all of you, including members and friends of our promoting partners, the Aga Khan University, the Calgary Consular Corps, the British High Commission, the Public Policy Forum, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, as well as the faculties, centers, and institutes within the University of Calgary, especially the Werklund School of Education. Our presenting partner is the Global Center for Pluralism, fittingly located in the Old War Museum on Sussex Drive. We welcome staff and friends of the Global Center for Pluralism and encourage you to follow them on Twitter at Global Pluralism. COVID has transformed how schools happen, which has prompted us to revisit the purpose of school. We go to school to become productive and contributing members of society. This means reading, writing, and arithmetic, but it also means social and emotional learning. How do we manage our emotions, build healthy relationships, set goals, and make decisions? Think of your most toxic workplace or personal relationship. They don't listen to me. They get under my skin. I don't know what their problem is. Now think of your most productive and fulfilling workplace and personal relationships. They get me. We click. They're easy to talk to. These are all features of emotion management and relationship management. I'm sure we can all think of times where we wish we had shown someone more empathy, and where we wish we had had more empathy shown towards us. When we talk about a disposition towards pluralism, we're not talking about checklists of inclusion. A disposition towards pluralism means we are socially, emotionally oriented in a manner that values difference. A disposition is everything inside of us before we even reach the point of a checklist. That disposition is grounded in empathy. Empathy is not sympathy. Empathy is a co-experience of anger or frustration, yes, but also joy, excitement, anxiety, remorse. It encapsulates the full richness of our human experience. The whole notion of citizenship presumes our fates are intertwined. We are citizens of somewhere because we share experiences and we share a future. Empathy helps us understand how each of us encounters these shared experiences, which fosters a sense of understanding and belonging, binding us as citizens, which predisposes us to live peacefully and creatively together. For this reason, empathy is a foundational citizenship behavior at the root of both nationhood and humanity. Joining us on our panel today are Dr. Dianne Gereluk, Dean of UCalgary's Werklund School of Education, Mary Gordon, award-winning, world-renowned social entrepreneur, educator, best-selling author, and parenting expert, as well as Kojo Otu, PhD candidate extraordinaire in the Werklund School of Education. Welcome to you all. Dr. Gereluk, let's get this party started.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, and I am delighted to speak about the role of empathy in schools, and what a timely moment to be discussing about how we can foster empathy both in our schools and our society. Next slide, please. One of the things that I think is really important is to think about the overarching aims and purposes of schooling. And that in and of itself is a debate that I think has stood the test of time. And there might be some variations of it, but I think there are three primary aims, whether or not it's worded this way or not. But commonly what we would say is, one of the primary aims of schools are for children to develop the dispositions and capacities and competencies to make informed judgments about how to lead one's life by expanding the varied and diverse perspectives about how to lead a life well. We hope that our schools and society will create the conditions or preconditions for a learning environment to foster flourishing and well-being for children so that they lead a life that is built around a holistic conception of well-being. And the third one, and it's a very strong historical one, but I think is still very telling in contemporary context, is to develop a stable and vibrant citizenship. How do we live cohesively together despite our fundamentally different beliefs and values? And what I want to argue is, while we've had these very strong kind of primary purposes of public schooling, mandatory public schooling, I think implicit is an interconnected concept of empathy that plays in here that we need to elevate in much of the educational discourse and the educational scholarship and policy and practice. So next slide, please. I start from the position, I think there is an academic debate about empathy and compassion, and sometimes they're interchangeable. But I take a very robust notion of what empathy entails. And it's both the experiencing of the feeling of another person, but there's an active component in that empathy. And it's in terms of putting oneself in their position. And that's the active concept. And it's very reciprocal in terms of, and not just simply sympathizing with somebody of a similar belief, but particularly those that you may have a very distinct and diverse perspective. So how do we have that elements of disposition? And what I want to say is empathy is required in terms of when we think about the first primary aims and purposes regarding how to make informed judgments about one's life. Well, if you're making informed judgments, what I want to say is part of a more robust notion of empathy is attending to our own biases and assumptions and recognizing the varied and diverse perspectives that are among us in our experiences and in our world. And what's interesting, is that I think the discourse has, the spectrum has shifted too much in terms of the development of critical capacities, ethical thinking, particularly related to, debates, and we're going to, look at the varied perspective, and we're going to debate it out. And what I want to suggest is we may have swung the spectrum too far in terms of those who are the loudest, the quickest, or the most confident voices. And in an element of waiting to defend your position, rather than listening, actively listening, charitably, looking and building upon the ideas of others. And what I want to say is perhaps what we need to do is shift that. Not that I want to advocate for critical capacities in debate, but more in terms of more deliberative dialogue. What does it mean to look about shared meaning making? So that we can, gain the knowledge and the understanding and the respect in a charitable stance for how we live well together as citizens. And one of the, distinctions, I think, is this is not about creating consensus. We won't have consensus on fundamentally different political, economic, religious beliefs, social beliefs. But there has to be a charitable understanding in terms of the weights and values and principles, the way in which life experiences that people bring into the judgments and discernments about particular issues. But having kind of an intellectual humility and open-mindedness helps to develop those what we would consider moral virtues, such as empathy. So next slide, please. I would argue, and I think many educational scholars globally are suggesting that this is a pivotal moment in history for a number of reasons. And I would say that education's at the crossroads. You know, historically, I think schools were the medium between the family and the local community and the larger public sphere. And that notion of space and time is now compressed with children who have been thrust into the digital world, thrust into public virtual spaces. When you combine that also with the broader external circumstances of what's happening in our society, there's political, economic, environmental uncertainty that we're facing now globally, you know, exacerbated by a global pandemic. You know, arguably, we're in a very particular moment in time and where education's at the crossroads. And, you know, interestingly, I think there's a danger or a concern, I think, when you look historically at educational spectrum in terms of what happens in curriculum, what happens in terms of the thrust of schooling. And often in these moments of these political and economic uncertainties, there is a narrowing of civic and moral virtues. And a colleague of mine, Sigal Ben-Parath, who is a scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, says in these moments of uncertainty, there's a tendency to go towards what she would call a belligerent citizenship. Where there is a defensiveness and a territorialism and a reclaiming of one's position to the exclusion of the other. And what I want to suggest is that what we need to do is you know, rather than a narrowing of such a curriculum and a movement to kind of very conservative notions, is to shift us towards more open deliberation in the face of that. So next slide, please. So, you know, my final comment that I'd like to end off with before we continue with the panel is, despite our individual or our collective anxiety or nervousness about our present and future prosperity, what I would advocate for from an educational perspective and from societal perspective is that we need to have the courage to be able to see ourselves and put ourselves in place of the other, and to see how we can live more cohesively as an interconnected, interdependent world for the sustainability of our future. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gereluk. I'm thinking about, my mind's still stuck on the charitable balance and the importance of having a charitable balance on particular issues. I'd like to remind our audience to submit questions for our panel through the Q&A feature, and we will get to as many as we can after we hear from Ms. Gordon, who is going to present right now. Over to you. Well, you're on mute.
Well, that would be difficult then.
It's the phrase of the year. You're on mute.
So am I live now?
You are.
Okay, hello again, then let me say. And thank you so much for putting forth this wonderful concept of panel. And let me just say, Dianne, I also, as Deb enjoyed your reference to charity, I have never heard before, and I'm enraptured with your concept of charitable listening. That's new for me. I'll be quoting you, but I think that's a powerful concept. And yes, this is a historic moment. I agree. I think it's such a watershed moment. And the importance of this discussion and the importance of schools, I think they are at the epicenter of how we deal with tomorrow, because sitting in our classrooms today are the citizens, the leaders, and the parents of tomorrow. And that's not just part of society, that there is 100% of society. So it's where I've put all of my eggs in that basket, because I just feel that the purpose of education is called definitely into focus now. And I think, as was discussed earlier, the social and emotional aspects of education, or the citizenship aspects of education, the humanity aspect of education is very much in focus. And I see there's a slide up here of 3 little girls in a Roots of Empathy class, and the little baby whose foot they're holding. This is the heart of the Roots of Empathy program. The tiny baby is considered our teacher, and the children visit with this baby in their classroom, gathered around a green blanket, many times throughout the school year. And the Roots of Empathy program, which is designed to address issues such as pluralism and to break intergenerational cycles of violence, is very much, I think, relevant to this conversation. So if we could have the next slide, I'd just like to give a little bit of context, thank you, Kristen, to my comments. This is our iconic green blanket. For 25 years, we've been unfurling them right across Canada, now on 4 continents. And this is the essence of it, connection. That children find the humanity in this tiny baby in its first year of life. And in that, they find their own humanity and the humanity to one another. Because the whole idea of empathy, which I think is the ultimate human trait, is that it can't be taught in traditional ways. I'm an old school marm as well, just like Deb. We both started off in kindergarten, and I try not to stray too far from that. But the idea that you can help children develop the ultimate human trait by providing the circumstances of developing empathy, the connection to the vulnerability of a tiny baby. And of course, there's a curriculum and there's an instructor. This is not just happenstance. And of course, there's massive research, because this looks altogether too cute. So we cannot assume that this is just fun and games. But as any teacher will appreciate, if it isn't fun, it isn't really done. Real learning, deep learning, is something that lights minds and hearts. It's something that brings smiles. It's something that reminds you that you're a human being. So it very much belongs in our classrooms, and there's programs for the tiniest children. We even have Seeds of Empathy, which we've got in your province, for 3 to 5-year-olds in childcare. So Kristen, could you please move to the next one? Thank you. Here's a little girl who's blind, and she's in a regular classroom, but you can see there is something magical about babies. Their bodies are theaters of emotion. They don't have any lens to hold them back on anything. They have pure emotional literacy. They don't have words, because we get lost in a thicket of words, but emotional literacy really is the affective side of empathy, as opposed to perspective taking, which is the cognitive side of empathy. And this little girl was able to hear and understand everything. And when the baby, of course, wouldn't know that she couldn't see, but the baby was immediately attracted to this little girl. And I have to say, we find across the world, the babies sense when there is something different that makes a child vulnerable. Who do the babies crawl to when they first crawl? Always the child who has some sort of disability. So next slide, and final slide, Kristen, thank you. This is just an example of what Roots of Empathy looks like today, digitally. So if you can imagine, thanks, Kristen, that's grand. If you can imagine, I don't want to look at all those adults, so you can take the slide down. But if you can imagine that we had this extremely experiential program where children chronicled all aspects, all domains of the baby's development, where there was huge exchange, where they learned body language, all of the above. So we moved from having a baby on a blanket, on a floor, in a classroom, to a baby on a screen. And I think in this digital world, we have a responsibility to follow the children wherever they are. And the children, their resilience is not something they're born with. Their resilience is something that is around them, and it's up to us to make them more resilient. And I mean, in every single classroom, there's emotional shrapnel flying around, which the teacher did not invite and sometimes cannot possibly understand what's going on. But through Roots of Empathy, we are able to get very deeply into how the children are thinking and feeling, which of course has everything to do with how they are learning. And this idea of marginalization, it starts in the sandbox. Children very early can capitalize and exploit differences. But in Roots of Empathy, they have the opportunity to learn that we all face exactly the same range of emotions. And they hear in the classroom how the baby feels, so they develop emotional literacy by talking about the baby's feelings. And then as they continue, we've got 27 classes across the school year. They, as an old school marm, many of the concepts, for example, we use the Socratic method. We only ask experiential questions. We make no judgments. We come from a perspective of intrinsic motivation and intrinsic pride. And if you want to build civil society starts in our classrooms. And children have the capacity to, if they're not in constant praise mode, intrinsic motivation implies that the children also in some way are trying to serve their own goals as well as just the praise goals or the competition goals. And I think that really serves them well. And I think the whole idea of landmines of the heart, we try to construct solid structures for children as societally and in every other way. But if we don't have the capacity to understand where the real landmines are, I think we really need to review what we are doing in the classroom. So we are honored, in closing, we are absolutely honored to be able to be in classrooms. I just don't think there's a more important room in the world than a classroom. Not only are they think tanks, they're feel tanks. And I think the privilege to work with amazing teachers and then bring our tiny teacher in and our Roots of Empathy instructor in, and to be able to continue to do this. I think teachers are heroic in these days and real leaders. And I think the institutions that support them and represent them need all of us to be acknowledging their centrality in figuring out our way out of this difficult position we're in at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you both for those compelling remarks. Dianne, Mary, both former kindergarten teachers, and I attended kindergarten. And so really we're all equally credible, equally credible. My friends online, submit your questions using the Q&A function below. While your questions stream in, I'd like to introduce Kojo Otu, a PhD candidate in adult learning at the Werklund School of Education. He will briefly share insights based on his research and end with a question to the panel. Over to you, Kojo.
Well, you're on mute.
Okay, do you hear me now?
Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the previous panel for touching on or highlighting on some very important aspects of empathy. We heard about the valuing of difference from Alim. We also heard about the importance of citizenship and children as leaders of community. I want to talk a little bit about myself and how I intersect the whole idea of empathy with and tease out a few elements from my own research. So I actually come into this space with multiple intersecting identities. First, as an immigrant, as an international graduate student, as a parent, as an adult learner, and lastly, as a minority man of color. I would want to add my voice to what Dianne and Mary just shared through my lenses by teasing out some elements out of my research on intercultural capacities and how it ties into nurturing empathy in people. When I talk about intercultural capacity, what I mean, it basically conveys a deepened and expanded awareness of cultural differences to engaging with and responding to cultural differences with sensitivity, appropriateness, purposeful and thoughtful intention. The whole idea is to effectively work with a full potential from a diversity of people, ideas, and perspectives on an ongoing basis with no finite endpoint. This working conceptualization of intercultural capacities in itself shares and bears a close resemblance to pluralism as an ethic of respect for diversity and difference, as well as recognizing different voices. One may ask, what is really the connection between intercultural capacity building and nurturing empathy, especially in children? One of the findings from my study was the importance of communication. The importance of schools in fostering communications is something that should not be downplayed. In this context, and for the purposes of this webinar, it is about how we communicate to children, both consciously and unconsciously. Without communication, there will be a breakdown in all human relations. I am of the opinion that children need to see parents and educators lead good lives. They also need to know why we do what we do on a daily basis. And as parents and educators, we communicate unspoken behavior to children all around us. I guess as parents and educators, setting good examples is key. We should be able to role model for children to emulate good behavior. And this whole role modeling function underpins the foundation of good character education. As an adult learner, I am very cognizant of the importance of social learning and the behaviors children around us imbibe and learn from us. We should never take the importance of good communication ethic for granted. We should strive to nurture mutual respect in our relationship with children, thus communicating to them that they are valuable and they are loved. From time to time, we'll have issues like moral issues will arise, and we should endeavor to use these as teaching moments through a respectful and emotionally supportive manner when we are sharing our views with children. I'd want to put myself, as a parent, I have two daughters. I always remind them that being different is okay, and in our differences lie the strength of our shared humanity. In doing this, it is key to drive home the importance of the perspective of others and be considerate of others who hold varied or different ways on how we see the world. Again, communicating empathy is a critical skill on what it means to be human, irrespective of your skin color, your gender, sexual orientation, race, ability, disability, and even religion, among others. In the work towards advancement of pluralism and global citizenship, parents and educators should be cognizant of the language we use around children. If, as parents, we continuously echo negative sentiments and language, it filters the children, and they in turn echo these ways in their interaction with their peers. Bringing up children is building the capacity for responsible citizenship for the future. At this point, one may ask, and how can we then help children to understand the other and be empathetic? I believe we don't automatically become empathetic. It is a learned behavior. Being empathetic is, in a way, is a product of the cultural environment one finds themselves in. It is the responsibility of educators and parents to nurture children to be responsible so as to grow up to empathetic adults and good global citizens. By doing so, we are in effect setting them on a path to influence their future as responsible adults. In my own household, I am fortunate to live with my mother-in-law, who is an ex-educator originally from Ghana, that's where I come from, who has been very gracious and very helpful in instilling empathy, kindness, and love to my own daughters. They are beneficiaries and recipients of generational knowledge on doing what is right. The way we come to know is informed by the social cultural background we come from. The beauty about empathy is that it is universal. Irrespective of where you come from, you can nurture and share empathy. I would want to end this with a quote I read from Nelson Mandela's book, A Long Walk to Freedom. He says that no one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or religion. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes naturally, it comes naturally from the human heart than the opposite. That is why it is the responsibility of educators and parents alike to instill in children the ethic of love and empathy. By doing so, we are collectively building the foundation for an inclusive and empathetic future where differences will be embraced and celebrated. Before I finally wrap up, I'd want to set the ball rolling with the first question for the Q&A. And that will be, what are some of the issues that will prevent children from cultivating empathy? So with this, I come to the end of my little contribution. Thank you.
Okay.
Mary, if you want to start, or I'm happy to, if not, in terms of, oh, you're on
Mary?
mute, my dear.
Okay, let's get me off mute here.
There you go.
Thank you. Yes, sure. And thank you for those lovely remarks, Kojo, and your lucky little girls. 2 generations of empathic adults in the one house. I think probably the biggest inhibitor to children developing empathy is the first year of their lives. And it's birth should not be destiny, but what I discovered all these nearly 3 decades ago was that empathy is innate, but it actually blossoms or fades in the first year or 2 of life in relationship to the attachment relationship. Now, that can't be, that's why we see generational issues. Sociopaths are born in that first, created in that first year or 2 of life, when they are not responded to in an empathic way, and when they don't learn that they are loved, all of those things. So I think it behooves society to hold, to take care of the family, the young family, and to hold the hand that untangles the matted hair, because that parent hand is guiding the empathy of the next generation, the civility of the next generation, and protecting the concepts of pluralism and citizenship. So that is the biggest first step. And that's why I created Roots of Empathy, so that birth wouldn't be destiny, because you can develop empathy at any time, but that is the biggest, I think, roadblock.
Yeah, and I would add, I want to build on Mary's point, because I think it's so telling. And I think, a number of multifaceted people would say trauma, toxic stress, elements of long-standing, neglect in different capacities, is highly problematic in terms of children's capacity to develop empathy when there's significant trauma in one's life.
Thank you both of you, and thank you, Kojo, for that those thoughtful comments and really important question. Before I turn it over to Deb, I also have a question for the panel. In this COVID era, where schooling has really changed, at least in the short term, what are the long-term consequences we see to kids who are mostly online schooling right now? And in connected to that, how can we catch them up, and how do we catch them up on the missed emotional and social learning?
Yeah.
Go
on, Mary.
I guess we both loved your question, Aleem, is the thing. So I think the tenor of your question weighed more on the side of the social emotion rather than the academic. And I think teachers are very aware. We find in our classrooms, when we're doing this virtual Roots of Empathy, many teachers are saying to us, because our first lesson is what happened. And in that what happened, the children explain what happened, and they write a letter to the baby explaining to the baby, the first year of life, this is what happened. And out of that comes a torrent of broken hearts. 2020 was the year our hearts were broken. It also can be the year where our hearts are mended. And I think all children need is people to listen and understand, to be empathic towards them. Many children, one child said to me, what has changed for you? I growed up, but my daddy growed down. And when you understand that, is that not a poignant, beautiful? The child felt more responsible because they were able to help. And the daddy, I think, was having a breakdown. So the daddy was crying, but the child wasn't. So I think children have a a very intense sense that there's something wrong. And as long as the teachers are so key, the relationships in life are everything to children. And I think the teaching relations are powerful at this moment. And your concept of charitable listening, Deborah, teachers do that. And I think rather than measuring children in their reading and writing and all that, for God's sake, they got their whole life to do that. But if we damage them at this moment in their development where they don't feel supported or understood or connected, this sense of disconnection is damaging. And as you mentioned, Deborah, the whole idea of toxic stress, children have definitely 100% been under stress. The question is it manageable stress or is it toxic stress? And it only depends on what are the relationships around them. So God love teachers is all I can say at this time. And let's support parents.
Yeah. So, similar vein, I think, Aline, I know that both nationally and internationally, this is a central question, and the common is this going to be the lost generation because of COVID in terms of the mental health issues, because of the perceived isolation. We're seeing that many underserved populations, either in rural, remote or Indigenous populations, where a number of youth are slowly becoming more silenced and withdrawing from school and withdrawing from the mechanisms that we would see in a face-to-face format. And so there is great concern in terms of this moment in time. And so the conversations, the obvious short-term one is that we need to create the space to reconnect when they come back, and reconnect now as best as possible, and even know that there's limitations. In terms of focusing on the emotional development, to have less stresses on some of the standardized mechanisms. It's a common comment amongst teachers is all the children are in the same boat, so there's no need to catch up when everybody's in the same position. And so there is a little bit of a attentiveness to not to double down in terms of catching them up to their for the 6 months or a year of delay of learning, but just to recognize where we're at, and we're going to have to readjust. And teachers are incredible in terms of attending to that. But I do think mental health issues are on the rise. Increased hate speech is on the rise. Children are in more public virtual spaces, appropriately and inappropriately, I would say, in terms of the difficulty in terms of navigating those spaces. And so I really, I think on a global scale, the educational community is saying what we need is to be attentive more to the emotional dispositions that are required given the time and space that we're in right now.
And I think early experiences can alter gene expression. We all know that. Epigenetics is something, it's frightening actually, and it can alter long-term development. And the very vulnerable families where, as you say, Deb, not Deb, but Dianne, there's an increase in domestic violence, and of course the addictions and the mental health issues, and unemployment has a devastating effect on some people. And so children are living in a hotbed of, potential violence. So that definitely does have an impact. And that's why schools can have a huge mediating function and, give a bit of a routine to children and give them a buffer to what they might be experiencing.
Thank you, Mary. It's, the reality is for a lot of students, sometimes the school is the only safe place for them because of their domestic circumstances. I wanted to actually pick up on the theme of some of the things that you've been discussing, and it is a question that's come across, and it's really is this whole idea of charitable listening. At what point is an individual allowing for the perpetuation of negative and potentially hurtful ideologies by listening charitably? What's that balance?
Yeah, it's an interesting, really interesting question, I think, and it plays out not only in the K-12 sector, but it plays out in free speech on campuses. And that's been a very significant debate in North America in terms of what are those boundaries, in terms of the liberties for free expression and the limitations, in terms of protecting the dignity and respect of individuals. For K-12 schools, I think there are boundaries. I think you can set up the guidelines in terms of what is respectful speech and dignity, in terms of what are the dispositions that in which to portray varied perspectives. So, there's an intentionality that can be done in a public school setting that allows for the limitations, that does not allow for hate speech. One can provide diverse perspectives, but commonly what teachers and educators will do is set up the boundaries of appropriate guidelines for how you deliberate. And so I think in a school setting, it's very, if you set up the basic principles of what dignity and respect entail, and articulate what that looks like, and to provide examples, I think you actually can set up very strong boundaries. I think it's actually fairly easily to do.
Mary, you have anything to add to what Dianne just said?
I think she covered the waterfront.
Okay. So how do you reconcile the aim of educating towards global citizens with a local curriculum and limited airtime for learning space in the more global perspective or the other perspective? And, we talk about civil society starting in the classroom, but isn't it distorted as soon as you leave the classroom because of the influence of media, entertainment, etc.?
Well, I completely agree. You have a complete opposite experience once you leave, but I don't let that discourage me, because when you work with a class of children, as we do, for a year at a time, of all different ages, up to, I guess, 12, they have a very clear understanding of what fairness is. You don't have to tell them. One of the exercises we do with the children, the 10, 11-year-old children, we say, the Rockabye Baby song in the treetop. I don't know if you know this one, Kojo, but it's when you probably have a Kenyan one, it's the same story. But what will make the cradle fall out of the tree? And we say that to the children. And they say poverty, racism. These are 10, 11-year-old children. Racism. They will say not fair when you're trying to get a job. So this, clearly they've heard this at home, right? So they will give you all of the issues that are in society that you're talking about. What about when you leave the school and it doesn't mirror what you've been talking about in school? But children will rage after justice. If they experience in their own classroom, at least in 1 year, that you have the right to be treated fairly. And I mean, in this pandemic, we've been doing a lot of talking about how do we diss one another without saying words. And you wouldn't imagine, I learned a lot actually. It's not just eye rolling, but there are many ways that we can hurt one another's feelings just by our expression. And children are brilliant at this. I mean, I'm still a work in progress, but they've got it figured out. So the idea is that they know what hurts one another. And when you have empathy, it's not just the capacity to take the perspective of another person. It's the ability to feel with them. And as they realize that if I say something cruel, I know how that will feel for the other person. And that idea, when it's not just the one child in the class, it's the whole child, all of the children in the class, it means that the poor teacher doesn't have to be the superintendent of justice and doesn't have to be the police person, that if somebody does something unkind or cruel, the other children stand up because they know how it feels. So it's not, giving them their moral compass, it's helping them find their own moral compass. And if you have enough children developing empathy by accident in school, because empathy can't be taught, but it can be caught, and it's mirror neurons. It's not, it's science. So I'm not worried. I think we just have to do more developing of empathy in children.
Dianne?
Well, it's interesting. I would say that robust conceptions of citizenship go into those deep elements in terms of looking at the dispositional capacities in the local. It looks at the evolving aspect and how global citizenship is evolving and shifting and disrupting. You know, I saw one of the comments, the questions about belligerent citizenship. You know, belligerent citizenship is a narrowing where we go to a superficial level of patriotism, looking at just the rules and responsibilities of the formal authority. That's a very superficial, or we'd say a thin conception of citizenship. It's something that we need to understand, but there's not in terms of an active element of what it means to be a citizen. What does it mean to live cohesively? What does it mean to live cohesively in our local society and our obligations globally? On a collective scale. Those are much more robust conceptions of citizenship. And I would, you know, similar to what Mary said, is children would love that conversation. What we need to ensure is that we have the space in the invitation for such a deliberative dialogue and an ability to actually go deep to what citizenship entails, as opposed to a very superficial descriptive nature of this is, you know, this is the forms of government. That's the entry level.
So there's a question, where does awareness fit into this whole development of empathy? Because it's, you know, you do need to be aware of situations. You need to be aware of yourself within certain contexts. And how important is the development of self-awareness, awareness in the context of others, in the context of developing empathy in children, or catching it and developing it or reigniting it in adults?
So I suspect Mary's going to say it's the affective, in the intuitive. And I would say yes. And I would say there's a cognitive element as well.
Okay.
So I would say that's when we talk about looking at one's biases and assumptions, looking at one's positionality, looking at different worldview perspectives. And that's not solely about the cognitive perspective, but I think it's a both and. I think there's an affective element in terms of what's required for empathy. There's also a cognitive in terms of proactively looking so that you become more attentive to what it looks like in terms of looking at the disparate or fundamentally different belief systems that we hold.
Sure.
And I don't disagree with you, actually, but I think cognitive empathy is where schools have been heroic, because typically teachers bring issues of injustice to children's attention. Teachers encourage children to problem solve. Executive function skills are something that teachers focus on. And this, I think, is magical. The difference between acting empathically is that if you don't have the ethic of care, which is affective, empathy, the ability not just to understand how someone feels, but to be able to feel with them. That is something that is observational, Deb, to go back to your question. That is something that parents, anybody can do every day. Watching television show, you can say, gosh, he looks sort of down when someone said that. Why do you think he looks sort of down? So parents have no idea how powerful they are in helping their children develop empathy. And because children watch adults all the time, our influence is profound. I know, Kojo, and you're nodding, and your family and your culture, it's a given. But we tend to describe and make many things cognitive. And my definition of empathy requires both cognitive empathy and affective empathy.
Yeah. And there is it's interesting because I think some of the academic literature would say that there's a limitation to empathy because, and I would say superficial forms of empathy would suggest that it's you're sympathetic, you have feelings for those who are similar to you. And so they would say compassion goes further in terms of that intentionality. I think what I'm hearing from Mary and myself is we want a much more robust and activist element and a reciprocal aspect of what empathy entails. So, I'm indifferent. Some people use it interchangeably between compassion and empathy, but what's important is not just a superficial, I feel sorry for someone, and particularly if it's, somebody who's like-minded or thinks similar to me. More interestingly and more robustly is when we think about empathy in terms of feeling for someone, particularly from a perspective that we don't agree with. That's a much more difficult disposition to cultivate, but so critical, particularly when we look at some of the societal issues.
Well, I love this. Sorry, Deb.
No, I'm just saying you're intellectualizing an issue or a feeling in that regard, and that's tough. That's a very difficult concept to teach.
Yeah,
it seems.
Yes, for sure. And to pick up on Diane's point there's in-group and out-group empathy, and clearly in-group empathy is a lot easier. What we really work on is out-group empathy. What are our differences?
Yeah.
What defines us? Well, the essence of being human, as you were saying, Ila, at the beginning, is to be able to feel, and empathy is the ultimate human trait. So I would say that, one of the studies that was done, a randomized longitudinal study they did, University of Bern in Switzerland, they looked at in-group and out-group empathy with the Roots of Empathy children. And it was very interesting. The empathy rose, obviously, a great deal in the Roots of Empathy children, and in the control group, it didn't change. The pro-social behavior accordingly grew with empathy in the in the Roots of Empathy group, and actually went down a bit in the other. Aggression, bullying, cruelty, all of those things that we don't want anywhere in society, went dramatically down with the Roots of Empathy children and stayed down. For the other control group, it stayed almost the same, but got a little higher. So what was the in-group, out-group? The in-group empathy obviously went up for Roots of Empathy, but it also went up for the outsiders, the other classes. Would they share with someone they didn't know? Would they help someone they didn't know? Yes, they would. So I think bias, as you mentioned earlier in the discussion, is huge. And if we can just help little children understand our shared humanity, which is our shared feelings, it doesn't matter what we're wearing in skin or clothes or culture or religion or any of those other factors which hive us off and marginalize and make one group think they're better than another. So I don't know any place where that can happen better than school.
Well, and it's interesting. Some of my work actually looks at youth radicalization and extremism and terrorism. And so you look at the indicators and there's no common characteristics of human traits, but there are some interesting dispositional indicators that suggest that may lead individuals towards youth radicalization. Well, what is that? Is a sole perspective with the inability to look at alternative perspectives. It is under, marginalized or isolated communities, a sense of a loss of belonging or attachment. A heroic narrative, of a particular time in history in terms of this, creating a martyr narrative or heroic narrative. But, when you look at it, so when we're talking about these dispositions of empathy and the greater aspects of global citizenship, what you need is the varied and diverse perspectives, the charitable understanding the values, bringing them into the conversation and the invitations so they don't feel isolated. And so, sometimes when you juxtapose in terms of those on the periphery, it tells the same story on a flip side.
It's so interesting. There were 5 cities in Europe that decided they were going to solve 3 intractable problems. And one of them was childhood, and how childhood can be a trajectory for all of the ills in the world, including terrorism. So really, they were looking at childhood as a slippery slope to terrorism. So they decided, okay, how can we intervene in childhood? And they decided that empathy would be the secret sauce, that if they could get empathy, the children would not be exhibiting all those things that you just mentioned, that they would not be social islands, that they would not be resented. They would be able to make connections and make friends and be able to feel part of something bigger than themselves. So I thought it was priceless. I never heard anything about this, but suddenly had an invitation to 3 European cities to bring Roots of Empathy, because they had the councils in those cities, Athens and Lisbon and blah, blah, blah. They had decided that they wanted to make sure that they didn't have terrorism down the way. And I thought so interesting in the UK, a 10-year study, they invested in Roots of Empathy to prevent knife violence when people are in their late teens and early 20s, because if they could have connection, they wouldn't be forced to hate and to hurt. And so that's, I think, more or less a continuum of the sort of research that you're talking about.
I wonder, there's a question that's come up that it's about whether either of you have tried to discuss what beliefs of your own might make it difficult for you to empathize with some particular persons or situations with children. So you've taken that approach with young children. And if you did, how did that discussion go? If not, do you think this is another way to sort of help children on their journey to understanding what it means to be empathetic? That can go to either of you.
I'm happy to go. I had problems with my own empathy when I was dealing with child abuse and domestic violence with teenage mothers. And I couldn't imagine that I could feel so horribly about the perpetrators. Because when I was a teenager, I used to volunteer in prisons, and I wasn't afraid, but I have to say my own judgments, and I really had to work hard on my own empathy. And I realized that the people who hurt, and that's basically why I started Roots of Empathy, the people who hurt innocent children and their partners were not monsters. They had no empathy. And why did they have no empathy? Because they probably had horrible first couple of years of life. So I was personally challenged with my own empathy. I wouldn't say I've overcome that. I'm, as I said, a work in progress.
Yeah, I would a similar aspect. And as a professor and as a teacher, you struggle sometimes, particularly if there's hateful speech. You know, I used to teach an entry-level philosophy of education class, and often there's racist remarks. And part of it, I think, where my empathy is a lack of awareness, a lack of understanding. I always say, you know, I'd rather them enter into the conversation and to facilitate a conversation in terms of raising awareness and talking about biases and assumptions, because an invitation has allowed me to have a perspective and empathy. Do I struggle? Absolutely. But if you look at kind of the dispositional qualities that we're trying to do, we're trying to create an invitation into a dialogue in terms of opening up and expanding their horizon of perspective and also challenging mine. And that's part of it, is to show the vulnerability on both sides of what is risk and courage in it to enter into a conversation with the overarching goals to say, you know, I don't agree with you, but I appreciate the stance that you're taking. And then you can, again, create the parameters of what does that look like in terms of equal dignity and respect.
Well, on that note, we're going to have to start our closing our webinar. I want to thank you both for such an enlightening discussion and for actually making my job a little easier. You just kept responding to each other's comments, so that makes my life a little bit easier too. But I want to thank you both for your insight, and I want to thank everybody for their great questions. And I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. It was very, very informative for me, and I'm sure for everybody on the webinar. And Kojo, our Werklund School of Education student, thank you very much for your thoughts and your insights. And we wish you luck as you continue on your PhD journey. In the next day or so, you'll receive an email with links to view this session on demand and a survey requesting your feedback. And before passing the final word back to Dr. Bharwani, I'd just like to thank him for his expertise, enthusiasm, and passion he has brought to this webinar series. Over to you, Dr. Bharwani.
Thank you, Deborah. And thank you to our incredible guests, Dr. Gereluk, Ms. Gordon, Chancellor Debbie Edelin, our great team. Thank you for everything you do. Empathy in person is one thing. Empathy online behind an avatar in a virtual world distorted by bots, trolls, and disinhibition, a new age tension arises requiring trade-offs between civility and the pursuit of truth. Both civility and truth make up society's foundations, but what happens when they come in conflict and you can only do one, or it seems like you can only do one? Is it okay to be uncivil if you're promoting truth? Or is it better to let misinformation spread, but to role model civility? We look forward to seeing you again on February 9th for our 4th webinar in the Pluralism series, when we will welcome Tim Caulfield, legal scholar, author, Netflix star, to discuss civility in the age of misinformation. By being here today, you will automatically receive an invite. Tell one friend to sign up, post the link on social. My friends, see you in February.